Hello, back again. Okay, I see you can hear me. We have already 57 attendants, is that the right word, for our session. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm happy to have at least 3 of my 4 speakers on board. There might be a difficulty with one of them, but we will start anyways, not let you wait. We have Raul Krauthausen with us today, Ngaire Blankenberg, Mandy, and hopefully later Paul Spies. And I was promised they can all wave for a moment to you before I introduce them. Okay. If that is possible, can you put on your video and let our audience just see you, and I proceed from then. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
I have a signal, yes. Okay, Mandy, hi, hello, Mandy.
Hi, sorry, I'm just checking.
Yeah, Ngaire and Raul, I see, and Paul is joining. That's very nice.
Okay.
Okay, I can hear you. Yeah, okay, here we go. Very nice. So all of you can see our speakers, and I will introduce them one after each other. And we'll ask questions, and we will discuss the topic of new audiences and missing audiences in museums, but probably in any communication format if you go that way. So the first person I want to introduce to you is Raul Krauthausen. He studied communications and has been working in the internet and media world for over 15 years, since 2011. He has been an Ashoka, is that the right pronunciation, fellow? It's a global network of designers of our society with the aim of solving social problems. He has received many prizes for his work. He's an activist for inclusion and accessibility, and his biography is entitled, "I Did Not Want to Become a Roofer Anyway."
We lost the moderator.
Hi, Raul. This is Paul Spies from the Stadtmuseum.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay.
Yeah, we've been working already together, but later we'll talk.
Let me go on. On his website, Raul Krauthausen describes himself as Berliner author, moderator, media maker, ambassador, and inclusion activist. Thank you very much for joining our discussion, Raul. We are excited to have you here. And my initial question to you is, what is the first thing that came to your mind when you learned our session title would be New Audiences / Missing Audiences?
Well, sometimes I think that those questions are kind of obvious because for me, as someone living with a disability, I always feel forgotten or missed out when it comes to public spaces, public places, public venues. And I'm wondering why we are discussing these topics still in the 21st century. It's like people with disabilities never existed before and never wanted to go to museums and so on. And what I'm really curious about and looking for is, can we find answers and implement solutions so that we don't have to ask these questions anymore in the future? Because it's not enough to talk about missing audiences, and it doesn't matter if it's people with disabilities or people of other minorities, when we don't change our behavior. And it's the little moments that can do a big difference. Then we will ask those questions for the next centuries on and on.
Okay, thank you. We will come back to that later, hopefully. The next person I want to introduce to you is Mandy. She's head of education at the District 6 Museum in Cape Town since 2003. Before, she studied education at the universities of Western Cape and Cape Town and taught for 15 years at high schools. Her main focus is on youth and community participation through integrational creative educational encounters. She facilitates learning journeys that aim to build solidarity across barriers of race, gender, sexuality, age, geography, ability, power, and privilege. I should also mention probably that she studied during apartheid, and then the University of Cape Town was by law for white people only, with permits required for non-whites only in studies not covered by universities for Black people, something I can hardly imagine, but it has been a reality and probably is. Thank you for being with us today. Speaking about new audiences and missing audiences, I would like to ask you, do you think we talk about two different issues, or are both more or less the same?
Well, firstly, good morning to everyone, and I hope you can hear me clearly. So I'm leaning into the mic, which destroys a bit of the visuality of this. For me, it's, and for the District 6 Museum, it's a very complex issue. In the sense that, unlike what Raul said, I think power and privilege in society makes it a complex issue, even though to those of us who are marginalized from museum spaces for various reasons, we can't understand why we've been excluded. Society has rendered it quite complex. So we deal with these for practical reasons as two separate issues, where we see the whole idea of finding new audiences as being more of a PR marketing outreach exercise, where for the museum's relevance and sustainability, one constantly needs to refresh audiences. Unfortunately, however, because of the way in which power and privilege operates in society, those who have always been excluded from museums remain excluded, because we see what happens is new audiences become reproduced from very similar class and professional interests. And they might differ in degree, but generally the bubble that we have come to know of as in the international museum audience, or even local museum audiences, remains reproduced rather than changed. The other way of looking at it, which I think is more the way that we at the District 6 Museum approaches it, is to identify who we're excluding. So constantly, it's become very much part of our DNA to constantly look at who are we missing, who are the audiences who don't gravitate to museums, who don't see museums as representing themselves. And in South Africa, it's been quite obvious during our democracy, where during apartheid, museums were no-go zones for oppressed people, basically, by law in some cases, and in other cases because the ways in which Black people's culture, heritage, history were mediated by museums was often in very similar ways to which animals are treated as objects, in dioramas, where indigenous cultures have always been demeaned, creating huge issues of self-hatred. And so for those reasons, the District 6 Museum, which is a museum born out of the anti-apartheid struggle, we've constantly been looking at who are these audiences who have been structurally, culturally, and socially sort of divorced from museums. And so we constantly work with marginalized groups. And we've had to therefore rethink the whole idea of what a museum means. you know, how people engage in the spaces, who's allowed in. And so for us, a museum is very much an organism. It's a cultural, a social, a structural organism, and depends on the kind of membranes we put around it that will allow certain audiences in and exclude others. And often these are intangible ways. And the last point, I think what's very important is for us, with our emphasis on the audiences that have been ignored or missed or erased, our programs have had to shift incredibly. So right down to how we understand the idea of curating. So for us, co-curation is not a trend. It's not a new trend in museums. It's very much part of how we engage. So how we collect, how we design exhibitions, all of these are very much people-driven processes, not professional-driven only.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. You already gave some solutions on a couple of problems, which is nice. Third speaker in our round is Paul Spies. He's currently director of the Stiftung Stadtmuseum Berlin. He studied art history and archaeology, was the founder of Darts, a company that has produced numerous exhibitions, books, television programs, and marketing campaigns in the field of art history, and became director of the Amsterdam Museum Foundation, where he introduced great success with new concepts. He's also chief curator of the State of Berlin at the Humboldt Forum. And actually, I don't know whether to congratulate him on this, but I can congratulate the State of Berlin on appointing him. Personally, I see Paul as a source of inspiration when digging into the idea of cultural change in traditional institutions such as museums. Thank you for taking the time for us, Paul. And maybe as the introduction question to you, where do you think we should start when we think about new audiences and missing audiences?
So, yeah, it's strange. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, fine. A lot has been said. Two things already mentioned. To be really accessible, to be really open for everybody, also technically, which is of great importance. And museums haven't been designed that way, and people are always forgetting, etc. So it should be a normality to be really without any barriers, and that's a thing that has to go deep into the organization, and it's, you know, it has started. I think a lot of people are trying to do it, and as you know, we are now making this new exhibition in the Humboldt Forum on the Berlin International History, and we've been asking many critical friends to participate. Raul is one of them, and we have been trying to be as open and accessible in everything we do for so many people as we can. But of course, it won't be perfect. So you learn and you learn and you learn. And I think that's a very important thing, the learning organization. I think that is what I try to be open for criticism, all the time, open for criticism. I know the District 6 Museum very well. I know, for instance, that there is there was this terrible thing that I don't know, Mandy, if it's still the case, but that this District 6 Museum, an example for us all over the world, was not regarded to be an official museum in South Africa. I mean, about excluding, etc. We are looking at that museum very much because it is, to us, one of the earliest and best examples of how participation as a base for everything you do is from the initial idea onwards, always there. But you have to know that we work with these, like you, the Naturkunde Museum, we work with these old museum, you know, fundaments, and to get rid of them is a lot of work and a lot of time. We have to work on the City Museum of Berlin. is now also participating in a decolonizing project. Yesterday we had a great meeting of our scientific board. And what you hear is that if you want to decolonize, for instance, which is a very important issue in Europe at the moment, and in the United States and everywhere in the world, where we talk about colonialism and post-colonialism, is that if you want to decolonize, you first have to think about the whole issue of museum. Do you want to be a museum? Do you want to continue to be that excluding institution that has been initially founded by white academics from the 19th century, and it is a prolonged in this time, in these centuries till now. We're trying now to work on a new museum definition to be more open for many more institutions that we would like to call museums, as far as I go, like the District 6 museum. On the other hand, I sometimes doubt whether museum is the right name for what we want to do if we want to decolonize. And so the funny thing is that the District 6 museum wants to be a museum, and we are thinking of, should we be still museums? So there's this discrepancy, which I find very interesting. Maybe there are two ways. Maybe there is the way that we want to decolonize and to really make free from its old ties, the museum as it is, and maybe stay museum in a certain way, but then anew, which means bringing in or opening up really for new initiatives, and not for marketing reasons, not for, so to say, new audiences to say, oh, well, I've done very well with new audiences, but really to make it a democratic institution, which is really there, like Nina Simon has described in her book on the participative museum, you know, the summit of her pyramid, giving the institution to groups or individuals or institutions, which we are also trying in the Humboldt Forum very, very much to really give over in certain parts of the exhibition. And then on the other hand, inviting new initiatives to be part of our network and to help these new initiatives to make a new start, a fresh start, where so to say, where the old fundaments is in the first instance not there, like with the District 6 Museum, which doesn't have these old ties really, and is a new start. And maybe we should try to be open and connective to both institutions, both sides of the same idea, that we want to work with the people on our history and culture and art together, and forget about what the official. So the museum definition as it is now is really difficult. We have to work on the new one.
Thank you, Paul. As we all know, change is a very hard thing to do, and it's also interesting. I would like to dig probably later into what you said about museums being places that are being excluding institutions, whereas the arguments for preserving the status is that they are places that are accessible and they are keeping all the things for the future and for everyone, which is sounds like a paradox now. Probably I have time to dig into that. Before I introduce our last speaker, I would like to invite our audience to ask questions. Please use the chat function, because then I can see it. If you use the F&A, I can't see it. It doesn't work. So please chat function, and I'm happy to bring all of your questions into the discussion. But now, our fourth speaker, Ngaire Blankenberg. She is a versatile and innovative cultural consultant with experience advising more than 50 museum and cultural projects worldwide. In her 25+ year career, she has been a youth worker, television producer and director, museum interpretive planner, and strategic cultural consultant, amongst other projects. She worked with Cosman de Young, founded the Museum of AIDS in Africa and the Museum of African Futures. She's also co-editor of Cities Museums, Soft Power, and Manual of Digital Museum Planning. It's great to have you as a speaker. From your perspective, what would be your advice for museum teams and directors if they are asking you about new audiences or who is missing?
Hi, and thanks everyone for being here. I really enjoyed. I want to pick up on comments that all the previous speakers have said. I mean, I guess in answer to your question, there's two things I would ask. Is one, is that what you really want? Because I think that it's actually a reality that a lot of people say they want to attract diverse audiences or audiences that they're not getting, but they don't really. So the question is, does the institution have a commitment actually for real to attracting new audiences? And I think then the other thing is to make sure that it's a completely institutional commitment. I think oftentimes it's, you know, there's a position which is community engagement or education or public programs or something, and that is the person tasked with the audience mandate. But I think that when we look at systemic exclusion, which is what everyone has been speaking about, that we're still talking about this issue, that these issues of power and privilege, they run really deep. And I think it's not so much a matter of, are we able to attract new audiences, but what is it that makes the systemic exclusion persist? And I think in order to remove the barriers and to look at systemic and persistent exclusion, we need to look at every aspect of the museum. So who's doing the social media? Who's the front of house staff? Who are the directors? I mean, depending on which country you're talking about, obviously the positions are different. And what are the barriers to each of those positions to thinking differently? I think that when we talk about shifts in power and privilege and looking at institutional transformation, which is really what's required to attract new kinds of people, we need to almost look at what I call radical minutia. It's the tiny little things that enable the power dynamics to persist, and the tiny little things that, seen as a whole, contribute to exclusion. And I can list in detail what many of those are later in the conversation.
Okay, thank you. You were off a couple of times, but the overall message came across, I think. It might be, if this goes on, probably later, I tell you, probably you can switch off the video, because then the audio comes across better, but it was probably just a minor thing. Yeah, we have already 2 questions, and I'm not sure if I should dig into the first one, because it probably leads a little bit away, but I find it interesting enough. So Paul, you get asked directly to you, what do you think of the new ICOM definition of museums, which of course is it's lengthy, and I will not ask to present the whole text here, but from my perspective, it aims to become all what you mentioned we should become, being open, accessible. But to me, it reads more as a vision than as a definition. What do you think?
So yes, what I said really comes down to that I'm very much in favor of the new definition, which is indeed not so much only a definition, but it's an ambition, I must admit. So the wording is fine, but I also was doubtful about, is this a definition? Is this a sort of, but maybe the idea of definition, you don't want to work with anymore, because definition is something like definite. And maybe we should be moving, and pantarei, or everything moves all the time. And we're talking about this now, and maybe in 10 years, we're talking about the next thing. And then we have to change the definition again. So let's talk about what is the issue. And I found the question of Ngaire very interesting. Are we really willing to, do we want this? That's a good question, because sometimes I feel a little bit alone. Because I know what she means. It's a lot of words, and it's so difficult for the museums to do it, actually. And we, of course, also have our bosses who say, oh, how about your numbers of visitors? and your budget, etc. So, but if we don't start to say we want it, we really want it, and the definition says so, the new, I would say, philosophy, or the new wording of what used to be the definition, it is trying to say that leaders, the museum leaders at least, should try and work on it to make it possible, and not just in the organization, because it's not easy to have curators, for instance, that have been always in charge of a certain aspect of the museum collection, and are shocked by the idea that they have to get people in to do something completely different with it than that they academically would have done for the rest of their lives, if it could. So it's not easy to move in the museum everybody, but outside the museum there is this large task to tell the politicians, and politicians that democratically voted for, it's the community itself that has to get used to the idea that the museum, as it is, this beautiful building with pillars and a pediment on which it says museum, and you are silent inside, etc., that is gone, that is over, that we want something else. And we're not the only ones, because we are talking about it, but the theaters are talking about it, the concert houses are talking about it, the operas are talking about it. Everybody is talking about, let's get rid of the original idea of that culture is, the Ausbildungs ideal of the Germans, for instance. I'm Dutch, by the way, but we have the same problem. And so, yes, we really want it. And yes, the museum definition tries to describe what we want, but it's not all of the museums. It's just part of the whole ICOM gathering. Half of it approximately wanted to have the new definition, the other half didn't want it. So we're on our way. And I can only say that I'd like to stimulate everybody to try and error. It's going to be a long way, but if we don't start, if we don't say we want it, then never happen. It will never happen. So it's not about the wording, it's about an intention. And the definition gives us the opportunity to say, listen, this is where we want to go to. And as I said, it's not stated as a definition, and maybe that's good about it, because definitions are new rules, and maybe we should free ourselves from too many rules.
Thank you. There are a couple of other questions coming in that I actually will mix into an own one. They point basically towards what all of you said is we have. It's not about coming up with a program. If we want to change, we really need to mean it, and we have to go deep into the organization and start with the roots, basically, and question if the way we do things probably already excludes audiences before we even act. And that is probably my biggest question, because when we deal with our new museum, new campus in about 10 years, I'm willing to do the best I can do to become a more open, more accessible, more barrier-free, more including institution, at least what the communication part is related to. But I wonder how much biased I am already before even starting the thing. Probably not answering about what I should do, but the question is, what are probably solutions, or what are processes that we can incorporate in order to avoid starting from a biased level? I don't know if whoever wants to start answering this, please go ahead.
I think.
Oh yeah.
No, yeah. Proceed.
I was going to say two things. I do think, Uwe, what you brought up is that notion of humility, which is really important, I think, is to start off by understanding there's a whole bunch of invisible things that you probably don't even know. And so to surround yourself by other people who may challenge your point of view. I think the other thing that I just wanted to mention is that museums are not by any means the same. And I think, for example, we're having this conversation in English. I think if we were having this conversation in French or German or Afrikaans or Zulu or, Dutch, it would be a very different conversation, because I think the way in which we speak about these things is not only very culturally specific, it is also specific to the cultures of different kinds of museums. History museums, science museums, art museums, children's museums, all have a particular language and a culture and a way of defining these things and looking at these things. And the reason why I raise that is that people often, I think, bring an Anglo lens to how these things need to be resolved in a French context, or they'll bring a European lens to how these things need to be resolved in a context in South Africa. And I think that understanding these contexts are very different and very specific is probably the first step to moving forward. And the other thing before, sorry, I hand over to Raul, is because, and the reason I say these things is I think these issues are so wrapped up on how we see our professional identities. And so being a curator in a German institution is one thing, and it means something very specific. And being a museum/activist educator in India is a completely different thing. And what you think to be important within that professional context is completely different. And so in order for there to be any kind of change, one has to also understand that it's not it's not just like, we're not all the same type of institutions or people. We need to look at where we're at.
Thank you. Raul?
I'm worried if this discussion is kind of too academic. Because the people who are sitting here, we are talking in English, and we are excluding a lot of people when we talk about a German museum based in Berlin. So I don't know if this leads to an answer if we discuss this question within this group. And another thing is that pointing from our perspective to the communities of minorities, we take it too easy, because what is needed to open communication channels to those in the minority groups, and this hasn't been done yet. I mean, when I read disability magazines, blogs, and so on, I never read something about a famous museum. It's only when it's about inclusion. It's only when people with disabilities can make an art exhibition painted by disabled people. But to be honest, and that is something where I get a lot of enemies when I say this, but having a disability and painting a picture doesn't make you an artist. So it's about empowering people. It's about teaching people with disabilities on how to become an artist. And if you are not taught what is art and what not, then you will never be shown in a museum. And if you are shown in a museum with your art without being an artist, then it's kind of charity. So what we need to do is empower people with disabilities and other minority groups to become great artists that can be shown in the MoMA, for example. And if we don't do this, we will only see these actions as charity. And so it's about seeing the value of welcoming people of other minorities and not only opening up a bit. Inclusion doesn't mean the majority decides how much space has been made for minority groups. Inclusion means everyone is different. And as that might mean that the CEO of a museum, I don't know if it's called CEO to be honest, but if the boss of a museum is a Black female, if this can be accepted by white men, then we would be a big step forward.
Thank you.
Can I come in there?
Yes.
Just a short point. I think about the idea of, you know, there isn't one size that fits all. While I agree with that, it's also true on the other side that people generally, doesn't matter from what community they come, have an aspiration to see a museum of a particular type. And that dominant image is the idea of a white cube, the European idea of a museum. So you even find that a museum like ours, who tries to do what I think Ngaire as well as Raul were stating, it's a constant struggle because even the pressure from below, in other words, the pressure from what Raul calls minority groups, and the pressure, we don't talk about ideas of minority groups, but the pressure of disadvantaged or colonized people is often the idea of gaining dignity by being like the idea of a European museum. And so it's not, it's a constant struggle to be able to, and it's very risky, to be able to be open, to have people walk over objects in the museum, to treat objects in the museum not as sacred, to do the type of things that I think Raul was stating when he said that, and people in the questions, that it's not just about legislating a new definition for a museum. It's not just about creating wonderful visions and mission statements. It's really about one's practice. And I think in a presentation yesterday about the limits of openness, one person, I forget who it is, made a very important point that there is this dynamic between the museum's desire to be open and the timing of it. Sometimes a museum might make a decision, oh, we want to be open, we need these kinds of audiences now. We need a whole lot of people to be bussed in who are disabled or who are from a sort of illiterate, inverted commas, community. But the communities might not be ready. They might not have a program, they might not have develop the agency, they might not have a story to tell to others at that point. And so I think there's always that dynamic between who we see as disadvantaged and who we see as being excluded and how we want to include them. So I think that's a very difficult issue.
I think I hear what you're saying, Mandy, but I think audiences are really interesting. Audiences are super flexible. We've seen so many different types of museums. We saw yesterday the Museum of Broken Relationships and the Museum of Ice Cream and Biotopia coming up in Germany. Sorry, Michael John. We see so many different institutions and new audiences go to new things, you know, if there's no barriers to feeling at home there. For me, what I think is also really interesting is what Raul was teaching on is how do we ensure that different types of people choose to be within the museums, choose to be the researchers or the collectors or the artists or the whatever, who choose to create the capital on which museums operate. And I think that's a really interesting question because once you have different types of people within those structures inevitably change. And the reason why you don't have different types of people within those structures is because it sucks to work at a museum for the most part. Sorry. I mean, I think that in a lot of the places, the salaries are low, well, unless depending on the country, but the salaries are low, the work is precarious. There's a lot of microaggressive behavior. There's a lot of barriers to institutional change. I think for the most part, it's a gross generalization, but museums are not necessarily attracting the most creative, amazing, cutting edge minds. And once they do, they kind of eat them, chew them up and spit them out within a couple of years. And so I think looking at, in a way, but looking at kind of like, how to create new artists, new historians, new scientists, and encourage those people to see museums and science centers and public institutions as an exciting, amazing career is also something that I think will lead to institutions.
Okay. There have been, again, slightly gaps in the audio transmission, but again, I think the message came across. I don't know if, Paul, did you want to comment that? If yes, go ahead. If no, I have to sum up a couple of other questions, which I otherwise do after.
I nodded when the remark was made that we're not very interesting places to work for many. And this is, of course, this is absolutely true. I mean, somehow, because we're not really open to everybody, not everybody is interested in us. And also, I don't think we produce for everybody, etc. Everybody is a difficult word because you can't work for everybody. But if you want to be there because of democratic reasons, I find it very important to say that we want to be democratic institutions, and then you have to open up in principle for everybody. But it's of course this great landscape of people that you cannot, cover alone. The cooperation between museums and other institutions is very important to make a strategy together in which we say maybe we have to focus a little bit on certain groups, because if you try to be there for everybody, you're there for nobody, because you don't get really into the deep to work. Like what Raul said, it takes time to then really to not to be academic with people, and to give the room and to build up a relationship with people that you can really manage, because there is so much to do, and you have to concentrate on things. So yes, the ideas are there, and then we have to find methods. And I think, I mean, the thing in my organization, what I hear also from certain people that are in charge of the democratic way to work, say, if we open up too many issues at the same time, we're not concentrated and we're not able to do it. So with all that I've said, I must get back to reality and say, we can take up 3-4 issues and work them out. And we have to divide, like for instance, Naturkunde and Stadtmuseum in the same city should talk about what are you going to do and what we are going to do, so that we don't aim at the same general purpose and are not able to do it because it's too much at the same time. I get this complaint really because I open up too many issues at the same time in this museum. People get annoyed, but also somehow. So I have to think of all these issues, and I have to talk about them, but I can't organize them all. So how are we going to handle this huge innovation we're standing just at the beginning of?
Okay, thank you. I'm going through the chat besides, and there are lots of questions coming in. I can group them basically in 3 different portions. The biggest portion is actually what I can read out of it is that people are really eager to learn now. How it's like an instruction, probably questioned by how can we do it? How can we measure success? How can we, how can we be sure that our path is the right way? How can we see that we are changing in the right direction? I probably would leave that as a last statement for each of you. Before, there are 2 other dimensions. One was stating that, probably it starts with changing staff in museums, but probably that's not enough. How about changing the working structure? And That's a question probably to Paul, because I know that you work with changing how we do things. Would you want to say something about that?
I must see that I don't dominate this discussion.
Yeah, okay.
Then just a few words. Get rid of hierarchies. And it's very difficult. And, you know, I'm from Holland and we work with less hierarchy. And I went to Germany and I struggle. So that's one. And it's a general thing, get rid of hierarchies. Of course, you only have responsibilities and you've got organization, but hierarchy is a big thing here and it's difficult. Another thing is try to cooperate. So don't do everything yourself. The museum staff should not be working within the organization only. They should work outside. One leg in the organization, the other one in the city community, in our case. So try to get people in who work with you and of course, pay them. The sum they should earn for that. And you have to organize that. So you have to find ways to finance that. And the third thing is, I mean, we try to work with different forms of working just to try out and train your people. So I take a lot of time and money. You know, the complaints are still there because we do too much at the same time. And there are new, you know, there are new power forming things and people take room and don't really share, etc. So it's very difficult, but yeah, these are a few, so to say, new developments. I hope people in the organization, not just the younger ones or the people that are a bit older and understand, but that everybody at least has a feeling, a belief in if we work differently. So an institution that wants to innovate has to innovate itself. So otherwise, you're just saying things and not doing it.
Thank you. There's a funny little thing happening besides that you, I guess, can't see, but because the audience is already discussing things on its own independently, which leads me to the second or next to last question I want to ask, and probably then more towards Ngaire, Mandy and Raul. There was a question that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the museums in Germany, Europe had to close down at a certain point, and they started to communicate digitally, which actually we do right now. And I do see great benefits in there because today there can be people from basically all over the world, probably not all over the world, but it's very international. I don't know, today the numbers are high, but yesterday we had people from Australia in there, today I think as well. So that, you know, would they have been able to travel? The question is, does this force into communicating digitally, does that actually, do we reach more diverse and more equally the audience society, or does it just reinforce inequality? Raul?
I'm answering this question 2 times a day. Because it's a question non-disabled people ask every time in the belief that technology can solve barriers in our societies. But the only thing that can solve barriers in our societies are people. So you can use technology for the bad or for the good. And we are creating new barriers when we talk in online conferences, like if you are blind, you can't follow the discussion as easy as in a museum, maybe when the museum is accessible for blind people. If you are deaf, you can't hear, we need a sign language interpreter. What you wouldn't need if you can go to a museum and read what is written there or play a video of it. So we are creating new solutions and new barriers in the same time. And I hate, to be honest, I hate answering questions like these, because it it stops non-disabled people to think about their own biases and to think about their own responsibility on removing barriers in their daily routines. Because we won't buy our groceries online in Zoom. We have to go, for example, to a supermarket or we get it delivered, but only delivery can be paid by people who are privileged. And so I don't believe in technology as a general solution for everything. And when, yeah, we are talking here in English. In a museum, I have the options what language I would like to see the art. So the possibility here is missing. I myself, I'm not a fluent English speaker, so for me, it's more stressful than sitting on a German panel. And this is something we really have to we have to think beyond the COVID-19, and because COVID-19 will stop in a few months, and then people with disabilities are again forgotten, because we are all happy to go back to a museum and so on, and people with disabilities are stuck in Zoom or what. So that's not what we want. And maybe added to what can museums more do. When I go to a museum, I always need a lift or an elevator. And I'm not using the main entrance. I'm not using the main way where the arrows are printed on the floor. It's not this shiny way of experiencing what the conceptor of the art exhibition has planned. And so when I'm coming with an elevator or a lift and entering the exhibition, I'm not coming through the main entrance. And so I always have to find the way, where does it start? I don't feel welcomed in this small situation already. So the printings inside of the elevator, where the exhibition starts and welcome and all this fancy stuff, getting a brochure and so on, I'm often missing out when I need an elevator. So that's the entry point of the experience, the elevator. And if I'm left out there, people with disabilities feel like an afterthought when an exhibition is planned.
Thank you, because that leads to the last round of answers, and you already had your part, and you also summarized basically what the discussion was about. Like, if you want to change, we have to look at the core of things. We have to start in the beginning, not, I am, as an exhibition planner, I start planning. I start thinking in the hall I will play, then later with, but actually I have to start outside the museum and make it a place that welcomes everyone on the same level, and that the little things that we often overlook make a big difference. So probably a final, no, it can't be a final statement towards the problem or the question, but to the session. I can assure you that you sparked a lot of thoughts and discussion in the audience. So I see this succeeded already, or this is what it was meant for. But, since lots of questions are dealing about, but how can we, we are willing to do, but how can we do it? Do you have like a little tip or something? How do we start practically? I don't know, Ngaire, if you can start with answering that, and then we go through.
participative goal setting, participative KPIs. So with the people that you want to reach, figure out what is the goal and how do you measure it. Hiring practices, I think, looking at internal power dynamics, looking at representation on all the marketing material, contextualizing science, not just the marketing material, the content, contextualizing things, understanding that I'm looking at the comments in the chat that science is not neutral. Decolonization needs to happen. Economic benefit needs to be shared with source communities and other communities. I think looking at how people of color are treated within museums, I think what's completely discouraging is not just people of color, but people with disabilities. People of color often leave because they're subject to incredible microaggressions and silencing and feeling discomfort. So ensuring their support networks. I think there's a really, really long list that I'm happy to like speak to whoever about in terms of really concrete things.
Okay,
and I guess
I don't want to be rude, but that is a good point. I want to give the others also the possibility, and we're running out of time. I'm sorry for that, but thank you for that, the long list. And you mentioned you're happy to, I guess, get contacted. Mandy, perhaps?
Yes, so I think solutions are always a difficult point. And yeah, I want to go back to what I disagreed with Ngaire on earlier about looking at local solutions. One of the ways in which we've worked at the District 6 Museum over the years is that we don't start the solution issue from how do we welcome new audiences or missing audiences. We rather think about how do we generate a museum or curatorial literacy amongst those communities who have been excluded. How do you develop or contribute to the development of people's agency so that they, in a sense, occupy the museum? So over our 25 years of existence, we've had lots of groupings occupy a space, including people in wheelchairs who came to us and said they want to be activists for our museum. They would roll in their wheelchairs across the floor map, which is quite an iconic part of our museum, our main museum exhibition. And all the museum professionals will go, oh my God, what's happening? And we as a museum would have to adapt to that. So I think the idea for us is to shift from this idea of how do we welcome, how do we design, how do we curate so that people feel welcome, to how do we stimulate people to occupy museum space. And the last point, one of the ways we do this, and we started doing this, is working at community libraries in working class communities where people have been displaced over years. We've started working with schools to establish what is called Kasi history rooms. So how do you turn the spaces you're in into curated spaces so that people in community make sense of it for itself? I, for instance, don't understand why people must go to a science museum and why not every single school is not a science museum or a history museum. So that's basically our general approach, because there's not enough time to focus on the specific really.
This is great because it's a perfect final statement. I'm sorry that I would have wished to keep going for another hour probably, but the program, I thank you very, very much for your openness, for all your thoughts and the inspiration.